Here's a revised version of the text in the desired style. Minus the silk tightens around your wrists. Not rope silk. Expensive, deliberate. Silk doesn't leave marks. You kneel on cold stone in a chamber thick with the smell of lamp oil and fear. The floor glistens not from water, but from something else, something you don't want to think about. In front of you, 3 doors. Behind the first, women weep soft, rhythmic, like prayer. Behind the second, nothing. Silence so deep it feels like drowning. And behind the third, laughter, the clink of wine cups. Voices discuss poetry in Arabic, a language you barely understand. Your name is Catherine. You're 23 years old. 3 months ago, you watched your father die, clutching a contract he thought would save you. It didn't. Now a man in spotless robes walks the line of women beside you, asking questions in languages you know and some you don't. His voice is calm, clinical. HES not choosing slaves. HES sorting inventory. One of these doors will determine whether you survive the next decade. One will make you wish you hadn't. And the worst door, it's not the one with the screams. By the time the story ends, you'll know what lay behind each door. You'll understand why, 12 years from now, Catherine will stand before a sultan and say words that should have killed her. You'll realize something most never learn about history: the cruelest systems aren't built by monsters, they're built by people who convince themselves they're being reasonable. Damascus, 1260th. The Crusades are ending. But for the women left behind, something far worse is just beginning. 6 hours before the doors, Catherine's father made a calculation that would kill him. He was a merchant, a good one. He understood survival in Acre, one of the last Crusader strongholds, required relationships that crossed battle lines. He had contracts with Mamluk officials, letters sealed with wax and promises written in Arabic and Latin, assuring safe passage for his family and his goods. He believed paper could stop steel. He was wrong. When the Mamluk armies breached the gates in 1260, those contracts dissolved like ink in water. His carefully negotiated agreements meant nothing to the soldiers storming through the streets. The letters he held as proof of protection became kindling. Catherine's father died in his own courtyard, still clutching a sultan's seal. Catherine and her mother were pulled apart in the chaos. Different hands, different directions. Catherine screamed her mother's name until her throat bled. She never saw her again. Never learned if her mother survived the first week, the first day, the first hour. 3 months later, Catherine stood in that underground chamber with 17 other women pressed against cold limestone walls. All Christian. All captured during the same campaign that erased Acre from the map. All waiting for a man named Amir Toshimor to decide their fates. Toshimor entered through the center door wearing no weapons but the simple robe of a royal steward. The gods showed him the difference that revealed his true authority. His title, Integration Specialist, sounds almost humane, clinical, like helping refugees adjust to a new society. But here's what it really meant. The Mamluks had learned something during their own enslavement that most conquerors never grasped. Human beings are malleable. Given the right combination of time, isolation, and total control, you can systematically erase one identity and build another in its place. They knew this because it had been done to them. Every sultan, every emir, every commander who shaped the medieval Middle East had started as a slave. Taken from Turkic tribes in Central Asia, from Scythian communities in the Caucasus, purchased as children, converted to Islam, and trained with ruthless precision. By their 22nds, these former slaves had become elite warriors. By their 32nds, they commanded armies. When the Ayyubid dynasty collapsed in 1250, it was a Mamluk former slave who seized the Egyptian throne. This created a paradox. The ruling class consisted entirely of men who had been systematically transformed through bondage. They didn't see this as tragedy. They viewed it as proven methodology. If boys could be turned into warriors, then captured populations could be turned into whatever the state required. Soldiers, servants, artisans, laborers, administrators, and women who could perform functions that free women of equivalent status could not or would not. So, they built infrastructure to process thousands of people annually. 7 major facilities in Damascus alone standardized procedures, medical exams within 24 hours, classification based on age, origin, physical condition, and assessed capability. The Mamluks tracked everything: mortality rates, productivity, They treated human acquisition like military logistics. Tashimura was one administrator in this vast apparatus. But what he did next would determine everything about Catherine's life for the next 12 years. 12 years. Remember that number, because at the end of those 12 years, Catherine would do something unprecedented. She would stand in front of Sultan Kalawan and during a public audience say place for women from the harem, never spoken unless called upon. And she would say words that should have gotten her executed on the spot. Words that no enslaved woman had ever dared to say in public. Instead, those words set her free. But we're not there yet. We're still in the underground chamber, watching Tashimura walk past Catherine without looking at her, stopping in front of a younger girl. Maybe 16th Armenian features terrified eyes. He speaks to her in Arabic. She doesn't understand. He repeats himself in Armenian. Her face drains of color. She shakes her head. He nods to a guard. The girl is led toward the left door. Door 1. It opens. Catherine glimpses sunlight a courtyard. Dozens of women sit in rows, heads bowed, as men in official robes examine them with the practiced efficiency of livestock merchants, evaluating breeding stock. The door closes. Tashimura continues down the line. His selections follow a pattern. Age matters. Origin matters. Physical condition matters most of all. But something else, he evaluates something less tangible. He asks each woman a question in her native language. The question varies, but the underlying test remains constant. HES measuring their capacity for transformation. The Mamluks understood something modern psychology wouldn't articulate for centuries. Given sufficient time and total control over environment, human identity is far more malleable than most people realize. Before we open that first door, one favor. If this story matters to you, if you believe these women deserve to be remembered, hit the like button and subscribe. It's the only way stories like this reach more people. Now let's see what was behind door 1. Catherine had not been broken, not yet. But the system knew how to break people without leaving visible damage. How to erase an identity while building new compliance. How to maximize economic return while maintaining control. Door 1 opened again and again. Women disappeared through it, one by one. Catherine watched, waited, tried to understand the pattern in Tashimura's selections. Then he stopped in front of her. His eyes weren't either kind nor cruel, just calculating. He asked his question in Frankish French. His accent was perfect. This detail matters. The Mamluks didn't merely conquer. They studied. They learned the languages of their enemies. They understood Christian social structures well enough to exploit them. Can you read? Catherine hesitated. In that moment, she made a decision that would determine everything. She could lie, claim ignorance, hope that illiteracy might make her less valuable, might lead to a less terrible fate. But something in Tashimura's eyes suggested he already knew the answer. Her father had been a merchant. Merchants taught their children to read. Contracts, correspondence, records. Lying would only demonstrate a lack of judgment. Yes, she said. French and Latin, some Arabic. Tashimura's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He gestured to a guard who brought a wooden tablet covered in wax. On it someone had written a sentence in Arabic script. Read this. Catherine studied the words. It was formal, classical script religious poetry. She read it aloud slowly, her pronunciation uncertain but understandable. Tashimura took the tablet, made a mark on his parchment, then moved to the next woman without another word. Catherine didn't know it yet, but she'd just been selected for door 3. Not the left door, leading to military households and domestic labor. Not the center door, leading to immediate sale in the Damascus slave market. Door 3 leads somewhere else. Somewhere that required women like her educated, multilingual, suited for administrative functions. She would manage correspondence, negotiate marriage alliances, handle diplomacy. But that wasn't all. 3 days after the selection, Catherine found herself in a different chamber. Smaller, quieter, with carpets covering the walls to muffle sound. 5 other women waited there, educated, multilingual, young enough to be reshaped. An older woman entered. Sophia. She had been just like Catherine, captured 20 years before, process trained, and now she trained others to survive. What Sophia taught over the next 60 days was systematic transformation. Forgetting who you were, becoming something new. Week 1 language. Not learning Arabic. Catherine already knew some, but forgetting how to speak in ways that signaled Christian identity. weak to body memory. How you moved, how you hold yourself. Christian women carried themselves differently. The differences were subtle but visible. The transformation required rebuilding these habits from the ground up. Week 3 Household management. Not cleaning or cooking. Catherine learned administrative duties, keeping accounts, managing correspondence, handling sensitive negotiations. Week for the most difficult lessons. What would be expected of her in the household? How to comply, how to survive. Resistance was waste, Sophia explained. The household had invested in you. Damaged investments were discarded. Catherine had seen the markets. Damaged goods sold at deep discounts. Women who had resisted or suffered physical damage. They would be worked to death, often within 5 years. The message was clear: submit, or be broken beyond repair. By week 8, Catherine barely recognized herself. She moved differently, spoke differently, thought differently. The system had rebuilt her. She could pass for someone born into a Mamluk household. By week 9, Catherine was transferred to the household of Emir Kalawan. His was a large estate, 37 soldiers, 18 administrative staff, 43 servants. Catherine arrives in a closed sedan chair, accompanied by Sophia. Her value had been calculated. Educated, trilingual, trained. She had cost Kalawan 600 dirhams. A substantial sum, reflecting her worth. Sophia left immediately after the transfer. Catherine never saw her again. The head of Kalawan's harem was Zara, his first wife. She ran the women's quarters with the efficiency of a military commander. Every woman had a role. Catherine's was correspondence management, writing letters, maintaining accounts, negotiating marriage alliances. At night, she fulfilled another function, one calculated with the same precision as grain storage. 3 years later, when Kalawan's son came of age, Catherine was summoned. She was now more than a simple servant. She had become part of the household's education system. But it was not just Catherine's body that had been used. It was her mind, her identity. When Catherine was asked to train a newly acquired Armenian girl in correspondence management, something broke inside her. She saw herself in the girl's terrified eyes and realized she had become Sophia. But Catherine could no longer accept the system. She petitioned for her freedom, and when she stood before Sultan Kalawan, she said words that should have gotten her killed. She was granted her freedom. Her story is neither pure tragedy nor simple survival. She had been destroyed in many ways, but also reshaped into someone who could navigate that destruction and eventually escape it. Her name survived in a household ledger, a record of her on a mission. The cruelest systems aren't built by monsters. They're built by ordinary people, willing to perform their assigned functions without confronting the horror they enable. And Catherine's act of defiance, however small, is the only victory that mattered. Remember her name. Catherine of Acre's journey did not end with her on a mission in 1284. She lived for another 31 years in Damascus. A free woman by the technical definition, but still irrevocably shaped by the system that had molded her. She never returned to Acre, never found her family, and never truly escaped the identity that had been constructed for her during those long days of training. But she did find a way to survive something far more complex than mere existence. She taught young women to read and write, passing on the skills that might otherwise have been lost. It was an act of quiet rebellion. It was a way for her to reclaim something from the wreckage of her past. She lived with minimal means but maximal dignity. Her story was one of pure tragedy, nor was it one of simple survival. It was a story of becoming, of being broken and rebuilt into someone who could navigate the system and, in a small way, outwit it. Her name, her story survived in a single line in a household ledger, a record of her on a mission in 1284. That ledger was preserved by accident, stored in a forgotten archive, rediscovered in 1953 by a researcher who unknowingly uncovered the history of a woman whose life had been erased by time. Most of the women who passed through the Mamluk system never left any trace behind. Their names weren't ever recorded, their stories never told. But Catherine's was. The question remains, why does her story matter? Because it is not just about the horrors inflicted upon her. It is about how those systems work. The cruelty of systems like the one Catherine endured is not only in the physical violence they impose, but in how they erase identity, how they erase history. The women who passed through those 3 doors, Catherine, the Armenian girl, and countless others, are not simply forgotten. They are written in history. And yet, their stories endure. Not in grand epics, not in marble statues, not in the things people choose to remember, but in the records left behind, notes and archives, names and ledgers, petitions carved into stone. History may forget, but these records don't lie. The systems that erase them may never be fully dismantled, but by telling their stories, we can begin to piece together the truth. Catherine's act of defiance, her petition for freedom, was not only an act of survival, it was an act of resistance. Resistance against a system that sought to strip away every last piece of her identity, her history, and her humanity. She may have been freed legally, but the system that had claimed her for so many years never truly let her go. Her petition was a victory, but it came at a cost. Her freedom meant that she could no longer return to the place she called home. She was free in name, but the system had already taken everything else: her family, her community, her past. It was the small victories that sustained her, the ones that allowed her to live with dignity in a world that had systematically tried to erase her existence. The story of Catherine of Acre is a reminder of how fragile history is, how easily it can be twisted, erased, or ignored. The story of women like Catherine, women whose names were recorded only in obscure documents, whose voices were never heard, shows us how systems of power can shape the narrative of the past, and how the smallest act of defiance can change the course of that narrative. Remember their names. Remember what systems can do when good people choose not to see. And remember that sometimes, the smallest act of defiance is the only victory that matters. The truth lies in the silence, the forgotten records, and the defiance that resists it. So, as we remember Catherine, we also remember all the other women whose stories were never told, whose names weren't ever written. We remember the ones who survived not through victory, but through the slow, quiet resistance that allowed them to reclaim what was taken from them. This is not just a story about Catherine, it's a story about all of us. How history is shaped, how we choose to remember or forget, when the costs of erasure. And in that, there is something we must all consider: what will we choose to remember? What stories will we allow to be erased? And which ones will we fight to keep alive? Catherine fought to keep hers alive. And now so can we. As you reflect on Catherine's story, remember that it is not a singular tale of tragedy or triumph. It is a glimpse into a much larger, darker truth about the systems that shape history. The women who passed through those doors were not mere victims of circumstance, they were cogs in an intricate machinery of control, victims not just of force, but of erasure. Their names were forgotten, their lives systematically obliterated, yet their stories remain buried in the smallest of records, awaiting discovery. In Catherine's case, the system she was subjected to was one of transformation, designed not to kill the body, but to obliterate the self. These systems of power, as cruel as they were not built by monsters. They were built by people who believed they were doing what needed to be done, by people who convinced themselves they were being reasonable, efficient, or pragmatic. They saw themselves as administrators, not conquerors, as planners, not perpetrators. But the true war of such systems is not in the suffering they cause, but in the fact that they work. They succeed. They are efficient. They function with the cold, detached logic of bureaucracy. And in this efficiency, the lives of the women like Catherine and the others were reduced to mere data points, records, files, classified information. And yet, through all the dehumanization, the bureaucracy, and the systematic rewriting of their identities, some women survived. Some found ways to resist, to reclaim parts of their humanity. Some, like Catherine, made a decision, a small, deliberate act that was enough to push back against the overwhelming tide of control. It wasn't a grand revolution. It wasn't a battle. It was a petition for freedom, crafted with precision, rooted in a legal framework. It was a quiet rebellion in a room full of silence. But for those women who never had the chance to petition, whose voices never found a way to break through, their stories remain hidden in the shadows of history. The Mamluk system, so efficient and meticulously planned, continued long after Catherine's time, shaping the fates of countless others. Their stories were buried in administrative records, in forgotten ledgers in the margins of history. The most dangerous thing about such systems is that they operate invisibly. We don't see the mechanisms of control, the subtle manipulations that strip away the identity of those who are caught in them. It's not about the dramatic moments of violence or revolt, but the quiet, insidious processes that make the victims of such systems forget who they are, where they come from, and even what they were once capable of. It is the slow, systematic crushing of memory of identity. Catherine's victory, a small act of defiance, represents the possibility that even in the most controlled environments, resistance can still take root. It shows us that even in systems built to erase, there are cracks small, almost imperceptible, but enough to slip through. And perhaps that is the most important lesson she teaches us. History is not made by the grand gestures of kings and conquerors. It's made by the small, quiet decisions of those who live in the shadows of power. The stories of those who were erased are the ones we need to remember, because they are the stories that reveal the true cost of empire, of conquest, and of control. So as we dig through the archives and search for the forgotten voices of women like Catherine, we must remember that it is not enough to simply uncover their stories. We must ask ourselves why those stories were hidden in the first place. We must challenge the narratives that have been built on their erasure. And we must continue to ask, even when the records are silent, even when the voices are lost to time, who were they? What were they capable of? What were they capable of? What choices did they make? And in those questions, we find the true story. The story of resilience, of defiance, of survival. The story of women whose names were erased from the pages of history, but who still speak to us through the cracks of the system that tried to swallow them whole. In the end, Catherine's story is more than a chapter in the long, painful saga of conquest and survival. It is a stark reminder of what is at stake when history overlooks the powerless, the silenced, the forgotten, those whose stories are hidden beneath the weight of empire. It is a testimony to the resilience of the human spirit, even when that spirit is ground down by an institutional system designed not just to conquer, but to erase. The Mamluk system, efficient and cold, didn't just conquer lands or defeat armies. It sought to reshape people, to bend them, mold them, until nothing remained of who they once were. They didn't just kill bodies, they transformed identities. In a way, their victory wasn't in bloodshed, it was in the quiet extinction of a person's past. For them, the process was rational, methodical, an extension of their own experience as former slaves who had been restructured into rulers. They applied the same system of transformation to others. The idea was simple: if you could erase everything about someone, who they were, what they believed, where they came from, then you would have an eternal dominion over their descendants. But Catherine's choice, her quiet act of defiance, speaks to something deeper than the system's control. It is a reminder that, no matter how far minus reaching a system of oppression is, there is always room for resistance. Even in the most oppressive environments, there are spaces, however small, where agency can flourish. And through that agency, however minute, there exists the possibility of reasserting control over one's fate, even if it only comes after years of subjugation. Catherine did not escape the system unscathed. The price of her survival was heavy, her identity was irreversibly changed. But she found the strength to speak out, to demand her freedom, and in doing so, she forged a path for herself that went beyond simple survival. It was a victory of the mind, a victory of the will, and a victory of choice, in a place where choice had long been stripped away. Her petition before Sultan Kalawan in 1284 was not just a request for freedom, it was a symbolic declaration that even in the darkest systems, people can find a way to assert themselves. It wasn't about a heroic battle. It wasn't about a grand gesture. It was a quiet, precise, calculated act, or decision to act on the tools she had, the system's own rules, the knowledge she had gained over the years. This is why her story matters. Not because she was a hero in the traditional sense, but because she became the embodiment of resistance in a system designed to crush it. Her survival was not accidental. It was earned, crafted through a combination of resilience, wit, and the sheer determination to hold on to something, anything, that could remind her of who she was, what she had been, and who she might still become. For the thousands of women who were swept into that system, whose stories remain nameless, whose fates were written out of history, their stories deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be heard, even if all we have are fragments, scattered through the pages of ledgers and forgotten court records. For every woman whose name was erased, there were others who fought in small, quiet ways to remember who they were. Their voices may not have been loud, but they still carry weight. And in a world that continuously tries to rewrite history to favor the powerful, it is up to us, those of us who can hear these voices now, to make sure they are never forgotten, to share their stories, to remember their names, and to never allow their suffering to be erased from the pages of history. History is made not by those who conquer, but by those who survive. And those who survive, even in the most oppressive of systems, leave behind ripples small, sometimes imperceptible, but still there. These women fought to survive, to hold on to some semblance of who they were, even when everything around them was designed to tear them apart. So, if you believe in the importance of telling these untold stories, if you believe that history should be told in its most honest and raw form, then subscribe to Crimson Historians. Each subscription is a pledge to honor the forgotten, to remember the lost, and to keep their stories alive. Together we ensure that history remembers the names of those who were erased from its pages, because no story, no matter how small or quiet, should ever be left to fade away. Catherine's name may have been lost for centuries, but we have found it again. And in doing so, we bring a part of her story back to life. Let her be a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always space for defiance, for survival, and for remembrance. Let her story stand as a testament to the strength of those who, despite everything, refuse to be forgotten. Her story continues to resonate not only because of her individual act of resistance, but because it reflects a broader, painful truth history often silences: those who are the most affected by its great upheavals. Catherine's survival, her transformation, and ultimately her small victory against the very system that sought to erase her, as these are the stories that too often remain buried. The women of the Mamluk system, like Catherine, were not just victims of their circumstances, they were participants in a deeply calculated system of power, control, and erasure, one that reshaped their very identities. Yet, Catherine's survival is a story of remarkable resilience. What's most striking is not just that she lived through this system, but that she learned to navigate it, manipulate it, and eventually use its own tools to claim her freedom. In the context of medieval Middle Eastern empires, such acts of agency were almost unheard of. Enslaved women were seen as property, their fates determined not by their will but by the whims of their masters. But Catherine's refusal to accept the totality of her subjugation, her decision to exercise her agency in the smallest way, with her petition for manumission, shows that even within systems that seek to strip away the very essence of a person, there remains a space for personal defiance. Catherine's decision to petition was not born of arrogance or rebellion in the traditional sense. It was a calculated risk, a precise action rooted in her understanding of the Mamluk system. It was an application of what she had learned about the bureaucracy that surrounded her, how it operated, how it valued service, how it could not afford to publicly disregard its own laws. By using the very structure that has enslaved her to her advantage, Catherine secured her freedom, not through violence, not through escape, but through knowledge and a profound understanding of the system that governed her life. In doing so, she defied the very system that sought to erase her. But even as she walked out of the Sultan's court that day free on paper, she could not escape the psychological and emotional toll of the years spent in captivity. The price of survival, in Catherine's case, was the complete loss of the life she once knew. Her family was gone, her community lost to the ravages of war and conquest. The identity that had been imposed on her over the course of 12 years had become so ingrained that even her freedom could not fully erase it. Catherine's story is one of survival in the truest sense, not just of the body, but of the spirit. It is about how far a person can be pushed, how much they can endure and still find a way to reclaim their agency. Yet, the women who passed through the doors Catherine did not always find the same path to survival. For some, the doors they chose led to oblivion, years of hard labor, sexual exploitation, and the loss of every trace of their past. Others, like Catherine, found ways to navigate the system and, through a combination of compliance and resistance, were able to find some semblance of freedom, but the cost was always high. The system was built not to break the body, but to erase the self, to transform people into tools, into assets to be traded, used, and discarded as the state saw fit. Catherine's story is exceptional, but it is not unique. Behind every one of those doors were stories, like her stories of women caught between survival and subjugation, between submission and resistance. Their names may have been forgotten, but their experiences were recorded in the same administrative records that kept Catherine's story alive. And it is through these forgotten voices, these erased women, that we come to understand the true cost of empire, the way it doesn't just conquer lands but transforms lives, erases identities, and rewrites history. Her story is a reminder that history is not always written by the victors. Often, it is written by the silenced, those whose voices are drowned out by the noise of war, the clamor of conquest, the rise of empires. Catherine's small act of defiance, her petition, was not just an act of survival. It was an assertion of identity, a claim on her humanity. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of systems, there is always space for a person to reclaim their story, to make their voice heard. If we are to learn from history, we must look beyond the grand narratives, beyond the battles and the empires. We must look to the women who lived through these systems, who survived them, and who, in their quiet defiance, resisted the erasure of their identities. Their stories are not just footnotes in history, they are the stories of survival, of resilience, of the human spirit that refuses to be forgotten. So, as we reflect on Catherine's journey, we must ask ourselves how many other stories remain buried beneath the surface of history. How many other voices have been silenced, erased, or ignored? And what can we do to make sure those voices are heard? If you believe in the importance of remembering these stories, of honoring the forgotten, of giving a voice to those who have been silenced by history, then subscribe to Crimson Historians. Let's keep the stories of Catherine and women like her alive, because history is not just made by those who conquer, it is made by those who survive, by those who remember, and by those who dare to speak, even when the world tells them to stay silent. Catherine's story, though marked by tragedy, also holds a glimmer of triumph, but it is a triumph shaped by the deepened, enduring scars of her experiences. She was neither the first nor the last to live through such horrors, but her path was one that took the most incredible resilience to navigate. Even as she survived the brutal machinery of the Mamluk system, even as she found a small sliver of agency in the petition for manumission, the cost of her survival was steep. She could never reclaim what had been lost: her family, her community, her past life in Acre. Those pieces of her former identity were gone forever, altered beyond recognition. The identity she had built in the years since her capture was what she was left with. And yet, the courage it took for Catherine to speak up in that public audience, in front of the Sultan, is undeniable. It's an act of defiance that speaks volumes about the human spirit. For Catherine, it wasn't just about gaining freedom. It was about reclaiming her voice, asserting her identity in a way that was never supposed to be possible for someone in her position. The power dynamics at play were stacked against her in every way, but through careful calculation, meticulous knowledge of the legal system, and a deep understanding of the social and political frameworks she had been forced to adapt to, Catherine seized a moment of control. It was an act that, though small in the grand scope of history, ripples out to represent so much more. There is something haunting about Catherine's journey. She not only survived but learned to navigate the very system that sought to crush her spirit. She became part of the machine that had oppressed her. But she did so with awareness. And when the time came, she used that very same machine to achieve her freedom. This was the paradox of the Mamluk system, an empire built on the backs of those it sought to erase. Yet in doing so, it produced individuals like Catherine, who, despite everything, managed to carve out a space for herself within it. But Catherine was not the only woman in that system. There were thousands of others, each with their own story, each following a different path through the same machinery of oppression. Some women found their way into the system's more brutal corners, destined for hard labor, or worse. Others, like Catherine, found themselves in roles where compliance was the expectation. A resistance, though dangerous, was ultimately possible. The very nature of the Mamluk system was designed to strip people of their identities and reshape them into something else. It was a systematic erasure of everything they once were, and in many ways, the survivors were as much a product of that system as its victims. The tragedy, however, is that most of the women who passed through this system left no trace. Their names, their stories were never recorded. Their fates remained a mystery, lost to history, drowned in the systemic bureaucracy that controlled their lives. Catherine, though, left a arcane aim preserved in the records, a petition that would go down in history as a small but crucial victory against an empire designed to erase her. And it is through stories like hers that we begin to see the true cost of empire, the personal, invisible toll it takes on those caught in its wake. This story isn't just about one woman, nor is it simply about the Mamluk Empire or the Crusades. It's a larger, more universal story about power, control, and resistance. It's a story about how systems of oppression don't just target the body, they target the very soul, the identity, the memory of the oppressed. They seek to erase who you are, to remake you into something else. But as Catherine's story shows us, even in systems designed to destroy, there are always moments of resistance, however small. Every act of defiance, no matter how microscopic, is a reminder that no system, no matter how powerful, is ever completely invincible. What happened to Catherine, and to the thousands of women like her, is a reflection of a darker, hidden side of history. It's a side that historians often overlook because it's uncomfortable, because it doesn't fit the narrative of heroism and conquest. But those stories, the ones of those who survived and those who resisted, deserve to be remembered. The women who were erased from history by the very systems that sought to control them. They deserve to have their stories told, not because they were victims, but because their survival and their defiance are testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. This is why it's so important to continue to explore and remember the stories that history often forgets. To look beyond the grand tales of conquest and to find the hidden histories, the lives of those who were not written about, not celebrated, but who lived through it all. Their stories matter. And just like Catherine, they deserve to be remembered. So as we reflect on Catherine's life and the countless others like her, we must ask ourselves how many other stories are still waiting to be told. How many other voices have been silenced, erased, or forgotten? And what are we doing to ensure they are not lost to time? If you believe that these stories matter, if you believe in honoring the forgotten voices of history, then support the work of Crimson historians. Every like, every share, and every subscription helps us bring more of these stories into the light. Let's make sure that the women who were silenced by history are not forgotten, that their experiences, their strength, their survival are not lost. Because these stories matter. They always have. And they always will. Catherine's legacy, though marked by the harsh realities of her life, continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. Her story is not just one of survival but also of transformation, both literal and psychological. She was not simply subjected to the whims of the Mamluk system, she was reshaped by it, forced to learn its rules, to adapt, and to survive within the framework that sought to erase her past and her identity. The system and its mechanisms, its systematic ways of processing, categorizing, and reprogramming, and yet, within that system, Catherine found a way to exert her will, to reclaim some semblance of agency. But as we think about her story, we cannot ignore the greater context in which it unfolded. Catherine's experience was shaped not just by the Mamluks or the Sultanates, or the political dynamics of the time. It was shaped by an entire system of conquest, oppression, and ruthless engineering of human lives. She, like so many others, was part of an empire that thrived on the systematic dehumanization of those it conquered. The Mamluks, themselves once slaves, had internalized the brutal strategies of transformation. They didn't just conquer and enslave, they systematically transformed the very identity of their subjects, creating new realities that erase the past while securing future loyalty. What's perhaps most chilling about Catherine's story is the realization that the Mamluks didn't view their actions as cruelty, they viewed it as an effective strategy, one that had been proven time and time again. In their eyes, Catherine wasn't a victim. She was a cog in a well-oiled machine. Her transformation, her subjugation, were seen as necessary steps in creating a more stable, controllable society. They had honed their methods through years of their own subjugation and, eventually, their rise to power. And in their eyes, she was no different than a piece of property, valuable not because of her humanity, but because of her potential to serve the state. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds against her, Catherine found a way to resist. She found a way to exert power, however small, in a system designed to strip her of it. She may not have escaped the physical chains of her captivity, but through her petition from on a mission, Catherine exercised the only form of agency available to her. She used the very structures that sought to control her to break free, at least in a legal sense. It was just a matter of survival. It was a moment of defiance, an assertion of her identity in the face of a system that had done everything to erase it. But it wasn't easy. Freedom, in her case, wasn't freedom in the way we traditionally think of it. Catherine may have been freed from the legal definition of a slave, but the psychological chains remained. She was still embedded in the same system that had trained and transformed her. Her new freedom came with its own set of challenges. She could never go back to her past life. Her family was gone, and the world she had known was lost to the pages of history. She lived in a new, strange reality. But it was her reality, one that she had helped shape through her courage and calculated action. She had carved out a space for herself within that framework, not as a passive survivor, but as a woman who had made a choice, who had made history on her own terms. In a world designed to swallow her whole, Catherine fought back in the only way she could. She used her knowledge, her skills, and the systems around her to secure a small measure of freedom. And though her story was just one among thousands, it is the one that has been preserved. Catherine's name appears in records, not as a victim, but as a survivor, a woman who had fought her way through the darkest of systems and had lived to tell the tale. Hers is the name that survived, the story that managed to break through the silence, reminding us that even in the most repressive systems, the human spirit can endure. But there were others, so many others, who never had that chance. Their names are lost to time, their stories buried beneath the bureaucratic machinery that sought to erase them. These were women whose experiences weren't ever recorded, whose voices were never heard. They were swallowed by the system without leaving a trace. We don't know their names, but they were there. Their stories matter too. The Mamluks may have succeeded in their attempts to erase the identities of the women they captured, but the historical record itself serves as a testament to the fact that such attempts are never truly successful. The women may have been erased from the stories told by the conquerors, but they live on in the fragments of the past, the documents, the letters, the fragments of their lives that managed to survive the passage of time. History may have attempted to silence them, but we are here to remember them, to ensure that their stories are told. Catherine's story is not just one of survival, it's a reminder of the strength that lies in every individual, even when faced with overwhelming odds. It's a reminder that no matter how powerful the system, the human spirit can find a way to fight back. Even when history forgets, even when the voices are silenced, there is always a way to make a mark, to assert oneself, to survive. If you believe that stories like Catherine's deserve to be remembered, that history is more than just the tales of kings and battles, then join us in preserving these lost voices. Every like, every share, every subscription helps bring their stories into the light, ensuring that the forgotten women of history are remembered. Their stories deserve to be heard, and we will continue to tell them, because their voices, once silenced, still echo through time. Catherine's legacy, like the lives of so many others, continues to underscore a profound truth that history is shaped not just by kings and wars, but by the countless lives that exist on the margins, hidden from the grand narratives that dominate our textbooks. Her story, the story of a woman who fought to reclaim her voice and her agency within a system designed to strip it away, is not an isolated one. It is a reflection of a larger pattern that repeats itself across cultures, and across centuries, and across systems of power. The Mamluks, for all their power, were not infallible. They had built their empire on the bones of those they had conquered, but even the most systematic empire cannot fully erase the human will. Catherine, like so many others, was caught in the gears of a machine that sought to reshape her into something she was not. And yet, by the sheer force of her intellect, her education, and her quiet defiance, she managed to carve out a space for herself. But her story also reveals the deep scars left by such systems, scars that often remain hidden. The system did not just break Catherine physically or mentally, it also made her question her own identity. She became someone different, someone shaped by the system's demands, but never fully consumed by it. Her journey was not one of straightforward liberation, it was one of quiet rebellion, of navigating the brutal complexities of an empire that had perfected the art of subjugation. And though Catherine's monition marked a turning point, it was not a return to the life she had lost. She was still a product of that system, a woman whose identity had been rewritten so many times that even she struggled to remember who she had been before. Her liberation was not a restoration of her from herself, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would never be free from the consequences of what had been done to her. In her act of defiance, in her petition for freedom, Catherine broke the most sacred rule of systems like the Mamluks. She made a choice. And that choice, no matter how small, was her victory. But that victory came at a cost. Her freedom was not true freedom, it was a conditional liberty, shaped by the system she had once been a part of. Her life would never be hers in the way it had been before the Mamluks had taken everything from her. Her story, though, is not just one of survival or tragedy. It is a testament to the power of knowledge, of language, and of memory. It is a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, the human spirit has the capacity to adapt, to endure, and to resist. It is a reminder that the smallest act of defiance can echo through history, even if it is whispered in the quietest of moments. And yet, there are so many who do not have a name like Catherine's to remember. So many women whose stories were not written down, whose lives were erased without a trace. Their experiences are lost to the void, buried in the sands of time, forgotten by all but the archives that hold their silent records. They too were once people with names, with dreams, with hopes. But like so many throughout history, their identities were stripped away, their voices silenced by the forces of empire. This is the challenge we face as we try to reclaim these forgotten histories. These stories matter because they remind us of the lengths to which empires will go to erase not just the bodies of their subjects, but their very existence. And yet, through that erasure, the stories still find a way to survive. Whether through small records, forgotten letters, or whispered memories passed down through generations, these voices continue to speak to us. As we remember Catherine, as we remember the countless other women whose names have been lost to history, we are forced to confront the reality that history is not simply the sum of great battles and kings. It is the sum of countless lives, lived in quiet defiance, lived in survival. Every name lost, every story untold, is a tragedy, but in telling the stories that remained, we can honor those who fought to be remembered. We can reclaim their voices from the silence that once sought to erase them. In the end, the tragedy of Catherine's story is not just that she was enslaved, not just that she was transformed, but that she became a symbol of the forgotten. Her struggle for freedom, her small victory, was a triumph against the system. But the true victory, the one that echoes through the ages, is the story she leaves behind. It is the story of all the women who never had a chance to speak, who never had the opportunity to petition for their freedom, but whose lives and struggles remain an indelible part of history. And so we continue. We continue to tell their stories. We continue to remember the women who were erased, who lived in silence, whose voices were swallowed by the very systems that sought to control them. Because their stories too matter. Their voices too deserve to be heard. If the story has moved you, if you believe that these lost histories deserve to be remembered, subscribe to this channel. Every subscription is a pledge to keep their stories alive. The more we share, the more we remember, the more we ensure that history will never forget the names of the women who fought for their place in it. Catherine's story is one of many. It's a story of survival, of defiance, and of a world that refused to see the strength of the women it sought to erase. But as long as we continue to remember, their voices will live on. The tragedy of Catherine's story is that it's not unique. Throughout history, there have been countless women who were taken, transformed, and erased, women whose lives were swallowed by systems of power so vast, so precise, that their identities were rewritten until they were nothing more than shadows. These women, like Catherine, weren't ever meant to be remembered. Their stories weren't supposed to survive. But somehow they did. They persist, not in grand epics or heroic sagas, but in the smallest of records, the most fragile of testimonies. In forgotten ledgers and the briefest of mentions, in the memories of those who knew them before they were lost to history. The Mamluk system was not just about conquest. It was about transformation. It was about turning people into something new, something the empire could use, something that would fit its vision of the world. Catherine's story, her survival, her defiance, her eventual small victory, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But it is also a reminder of how easily that spirit can be crushed when systems like this take hold. How quickly the power of empire can strip away not just freedom, but the very core of who someone is. But Catherine's act of defiance, her decision to petition for her freedom, is more than just an individual victory. It is a victory for all those women whose stories were lost in the cracks of history. It is a reminder that no matter how powerful the systems of control may seem, there is always room for resistance, for agency, for the smallest of choices. Even in the darkest of places, even under the heaviest of systems, there are moments where the human will shines through, where people refuse to be entirely shaped by their circumstances. Her story also serves as a chilling warning. It shows us how systems of control can thrive when people are willing to turn a blind eye, when ordinary people perform their roles, when they act as though they are simply following orders, when they convince themselves that they are being reasonable. It allows these systems to continue, to perpetuate, and to grow. It is the willingness to ignore the consequences of our actions, the refusal to confront the harm that we enable, that allows empires to thrive. But Catherine's defiance, the small in the grand scheme of history, is a reminder that even in the most oppressive systems, there is always a chance for someone to break free. It is the kind of rebellion that might seem insignificant at first, but in its persistence, in its quiet determination, it becomes a powerful force. Catherine didn't overthrow the Mamluk Empire. She didn't bring about its downfall, but in petitioning for her freedom, in demanding a place for herself within that empire, she carved out a space where others might do the same. She made a statement that would echo far beyond the walls of the household where she had spent 12 years of her life. Her story, like so many others, is a reminder of the power of memory. But the stories we tell, the histories we choose to preserve, and the ones we choose to forget. It's easy to romanticize history, to look at the great battles, the grand leaders, and the shining moments of victory. But the real history, the history that shapes the world we live in today, is made up of the quiet struggles of those who were erased, of those whose stories were never told. As we continue to tell Catherine's story, as we continue to share the stories of the countless women whose names were lost, we are ensuring that their lives are not forgotten. We are taking their stories out of the shadows and into the light. We are remembering them not just as victims, but just as survivors, but as people who fought to hold on to their humanity in the face of overwhelming forces. So, let's keep telling these stories. Let's keep remembering the women who were erased from history, because the more we remember, the more we ensure that their voices are heard. And as long as we keep telling their stories, their lives will never truly be forgotten. Subscribe to this channel, not just for the stories we've already shared, but for the ones still to come. Every subscription, every share, every like is a step toward remembering the women who were lost, who fought to be heard, and whose stories deserve to be told. Together, we can make sure that history never forgets the names of the women who survived, who resisted, and who changed the course of history, even in the smallest of ways. Because in the end, it's not just about what the history books say. It's about what we choose to remember.